Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And as we talked about yesterday, we're going to be talking about the men's issue. As a matter of fact, I might just point to the fact that my commentary yesterday was on the male crisis. We also did one a while back called American Idol, IDLE, talking about the fact that according to the Department of Labor, 1 in 3 men were neither working nor looking for a job as recently as April. And so there is a real need to really emphasize men, masculinity, and to think through some of these issues. Oftentimes when I travel around to the various churches and even radio stations that carry this program, many times they'll ask me to go and speak to a men's group, and almost without exception they say, well, the women's group is going pretty well. They kind of develop these steel magnolia relationships. The men's group needs some help, although I've seen some that really are blowing and going. But if you're looking for something to encourage men, and this could be a pastor, an elder, a church leader, or if you're a wife and you're saying, I would like to encourage my husband, my brother, my father, I think you're going to really enjoy this book. It is written by Dr. Paul Pettit. It is entitled A Courageous Identity. Now, Paul Pettit has been on the program with us before. He's the Director of Career Services. He teaches in the departments of Spiritual Formation and Pastoral Ministries, works with, of course, the alumni. Some of his books, we have a whole list of them, Dynamic Dads, How to Be a Hero to Your Kids, Foundations of Spiritual Formation, Blessed Are the Balanced. He is an individual that is a graduate of Moody Bible, as well as University of Kansas, and has his doctorate from Dallas Theological Seminary. And Paul Pettit, is always great to see you.
Thanks, Kerby. Great to be here. Great to be back.
Last time you were here, you brought a whole lot of students that were watching the interview, and we have a few people watching, but not quite as many as you brought in from Dallas Seminary last time. And this book is entitled Courageous Identity. Now, this is published by Whitaker House. You probably can find it in your local bookstore because it's just come out, but if you have any difficulty, of course, we have a link to it on our website. Courageous Identity, Accepting the Call of Christ-Centered Masculinity. And it's interesting because in the commentary that I wrote the other day, which aired yesterday, I mentioned Nancy Pearcey's book, and for those of you watching online, I'll hold that up because we did that interview a while back with her a couple of years ago, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And that book and your book both refer to it because we recognize that men sort of are caught in this crossfire. They're being told in the church to be the godly men, to actually lead their families and to actually go out there and exercise godly masculinity. They're being told by the culture that what they are doing is toxic, and many women are saying, I don't even have a place for a man in my life, and I can't think of a reason why people would want to have a book more than to have this book, because it answers many of those questions. And that's really why you wrote it, isn't it?
That's right. We're talking about an identity where a man says, I want to follow Jesus Christ. I want to follow the Bible. I want to follow the Scriptures. But in today's culture, that can take courage, because he comes out and says, I follow Jesus Christ, I follow the Bible. And they say, oh, wait a minute, are you toxic? Are you violent? So there's an authority there, but it's an authority to serve. Whenever we see Jesus in a leadership position and a position of authority, he's always putting a towel over his arm. He's washing the disciples' feet. He's laying down his life for his bride. So there is a masculinity that's a godly masculinity. It's not like the world's masculinity. It's not a toxic masculinity, but it's a Christ-centered masculinity.
I might just mention the book is broken into 3 or 4 sections. By the time you get to the 4th section, it's serving in worship, serving in the home, serving in the community. So serving is a big issue. Humility is a big issue. And to give her due, Nancy Pearcey pointed out that actually there were research studies that were done, and they found that, interestingly enough, those men who attend church on a regular basis shatter all of those negative stereotypes. They are more loving to their wives, more emotionally engaged with their children. As a matter of fact, less likely to divorce and less likely to commit domestic violence. So in some respects, we certainly do identify the whole issue of toxic manhood and the Me Too phenomenon. In some respects, that's sort of in the background. But what I love about this, Paul, is that you spend a fair amount of time just teaching basic theology. Section 1 is who can practice Christ-centered masculinity. And so if you maybe right now are leading a small group of men, and you feel like I really need to teach them kind of Bible 101, but they really want to know what it means to be a man, you sort of take them through some Bible teaching first, which they need to have, and at the same time, they'll be willing to put up with some of that because, in a sense, they're wanting to answer some of those questions. So you really take us through this whole section, and one of those, if we can talk about it for just a minute, is the fact that we're created in the Imago Dei. Can you explain?
That's right. In the Imago Dei, we're created fully human, but we're created in two types, and that is male and female. And he says it's very good, very interesting that he doesn't say we're created tall and short or black and white or fat and skinny. Male and female seems to be one of the major dividing points. And so in our culture today, where people are saying, oh, there's hundreds of genders, or you can choose your own gender, the scriptures point to a husband and a wife, a father and a mother. So God's good design for marriage, God's good design for family involves a male who serves as a husband or a father and a female who serves as a mother or a wife. But boy, that's countercultural today.
It certainly is. And one of the things you do from time to time is show some graphs, and we talked about those the other day because we had an interview that we did in which we were talking about some of the graphs that came from the professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. And you have a
Brad
very
Wilcox,
similar graph, Brad Wilcox, who was, again, an individual we've interviewed, and we also quoted from him. This particular chart actually, again, shows that married share of the male household population is declining. So we are in a situation where fewer and fewer are getting married, fewer men head of the household. And so if there's ever a need for a book on courageous identity, that's exactly why you've written this, isn't it?
And we're seeing that 33% of kids are growing up in a home today with no father figure. It's unbelievable. Some are calling it a fatherless America, where there's a real lack of fatherhood. But we know that you can be raised by a single mom and still be great, but there needs to be that masculine influence, a coach, a teacher, a father figure, an uncle, a grandfather. So a boy has to leave the world of the feminine and be accepted into the world of the masculine. There's a break there. And we know that from the marriage that says you have to leave and then cleave. A man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. So there is that break from the feminine where a boy becomes masculine.
And again, I've talked about, and of course you are in a church, so you can relate to this, that sometimes for the single moms, we say, let's see if we can find a male mentor.
Absolutely.
And many times it's a coach, if they're into sports, or in some cases it could be that they're really into computers, and you go to one of these computer shows or something like that, because there's just a real need for boys to figure out what it means to be a man, and they live in a world of women, by and large. So many of the teachers in grade school and even junior high tend to be women. And so that's another aspect of that as well, because this whole chapter on created in the Imago Dei gets into different aspects of marriage. What about single men? What about children and all the rest? But we need to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the flip side of that and then get into some of the other issues. Who can practice Christ-centered masculinity? Where are the Christ-centered men? Lots of things to talk about right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
There's a phrase I often hear at conferences and on YouTube videos that is usually credited to Lynn Alden, author of the excellent book Broken Money. She and others often use the phrase "nothing stops this train" to illustrate the unstoppable momentum of fiscal deficits. She borrowed the phrase from a line in the program Breaking Bad. Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager and founder of Bridgewater Associates. I think he might start using the phrase. He was in Washington, D.C. to meet with senior leaders on the Republican side and Democratic side about the budget deficit. He explained that virtually everyone agrees that you have to get the budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. He then asked them the logical question, why can't you make a pledge that you will get it down to 3%? They explained the absolute policies that must exist. You must make statements like, I will absolutely pledge not to raise your taxes. I will absolutely pledge not to reduce your benefits. He concluded that this is the equivalent of an absolute pledge not to change the trajectory we're on in order to have a better set of circumstances than the likely financial crash that we're going to have. He lamented that they all agree about the consequences of this debt problem, and they all agree that they cannot speak up about it because their constituents would throw them out of office, and their political parties would exert enough pressure on them that it is impossible to make those compromising statements and actions that bring together the revenue and expenses to produce a good budget. You know, we have a $39 trillion national debt and nearly $2 trillion deficits each year. Ray Dalio's conversation with the political leadership illustrates that Congress can't stop the debt train. And that's why I've concluded nothing stops this train. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Dr. Paul Pettit in studio with us today. Let me just mention that if you go to the website, the newly revamped Point of View website, you will see a picture of Paul. You can click on a button that says Read More, View the Profile. There's a place where you could link up with him in LinkedIn or Facebook. Matter of fact, probably Facebook would be a good way to connect up with him, or, of course, at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I might just mention right now, Paul, you would be a great speaker for men's retreats and to take this book and work your way through that. So if you're maybe wanting to launch a men's retreat or maybe trying to develop your men's movement in your church, this is a book to get started with, but also I would encourage people to contact you because you're available, aren't you?
Love doing that. Love speaking at a father-daughter event, a father-son event, or a men's weekend retreat. That's awesome.
Well, we talked good news. We're created in God's image. Bad news is we have a sin nature.
That's right.
And you take us to the fallen issue, which reminds us that we also, as you go through that, have to deal with, and I thought this was really good. I appreciate your vulnerability, dangerous landmines, pornography, human trafficking, and things of that nature. So let's, if we can, talk about the flip side of that, because that's a real problem as well.
Redeemed masculinity is very healthy. It's servant leadership. But unredeemed masculinity, raw masculinity, is oftentimes selfish, violent. We're bigger than women, so sometimes an ungodly man would take advantage of a woman. We're greedy, so we maybe steal from the office. So there is a toxic masculinity out there, and it's ugly. But what the feminists did in the 70s was second wave feminism. All of masculinity itself is toxic. You see what they did there?
Yeah.
There can be a healthy masculinity. There can be a godly masculinity. But they said toxic masculinity itself is wrong. And if you would just act more feminine, Kerby, if you would become feminine, then you would be a good person. So a lot of men are very confused by this. They're told, you need to be more soft. You need to be more kind. Actually, you need to act like us. You need to act like a woman. Then you'll be accepted. But the scriptures say that, again, both masculinity and femininity can be redeemed, and masculinity has a very important place in our culture.
Well, and again, part of the way in which this is surfaced is we talk quite a bit, Paul, about what's happening with Generation Y, the millennial generation, especially Generation Z. And this may be the first time in history in which more Gen Z men are interested in church than Gen Z women. More Gen Z men are interested in marriage than Gen Z women. And you can go out on YouTube and see interviews that they've done with women saying, being asked, well, do you need a man in your life? No, I don't need a man in my life. Matter of fact, fact, I don't want a man in my life. And you can see how that particular issue has played itself out. Now, you go back to some of the conversation we've had with Sandra Glahn, who you know at Dallas Seminary, and others, and with even Nancy Piercy. It used to be that the women were getting this cross-cultural message. Some being told you need to be a homemaker. Some said that you need to go out into the workforce. And the people, women in the workforce were feeling a little bit strange because they weren't at home, and the ones at home feel like they were missing out. But we have the same thing happening for men, this cross-cultural message that is really hurting them. And talk about some of those landmines, because in some respects it is real easy because of these digital devices we carry around in our pockets.
That's right.
For some really unhealthy things to develop among men.
For example, pornography. When you and I were young, you'd see some guy sneaking into a bookstore with a brown paper bag, maybe buying a magazine. Today, a young man pulls out his cell phone, and he's right there immediately with 3 or 4 clicks away. Or gambling. You remember gambling was you go find a bookie or you go to Las Vegas. Today, online gambling, which
exploded,
is one of the dangerous things. Young men, they have their credit cards hooked up to the gambling. They have their bank account. And in the middle of the game, they get a ping on their phone. It says, come on, are you going to double down? Are you going to do this? And their buddies are saying, come on, man, do it. And it's talked about as terror among young men who are going broke online gambling. So, yeah, there's some pulls, there's some sins, there's some downfalls that young men are facing that maybe they didn't face in a previous generation. But they still need to turn to Jesus Christ for the answer.
Might just mention, too, that we have booklets on a biblical view on pornography, a biblical view on gambling, and the rest. But you've been talking about this idea of redeemed, which is the 3rd chapter, redeemed, Christ in the cross. Because it does seem to me that there are some issues. One that you talk about is the importance of forgiveness. How many times have we run into men who are actually marked or flawed because of a difficulty with their father? And so we're going to talk a little bit later about promise keepers, and that's one of the things they certainly took people through. But this idea of being redeemed is a really key aspect of that first section, isn't it?
That's right. A lot of men I work with, 30 years old, 40 years old, Kerby, they say, I just wish my father would say, I'm proud of you. I just wish my father would say, I love you. So there's a father hunger out there. There's a hunger for an older, wiser man, maybe a man that's paid the stupid tax, maybe a man with some gray hair who would mentor me or disciple me. So I think in our culture, there's a real hunger for what does it mean to be a real man, not a violent man, not an evil man, but what does it mean to be a real man? Just like Jesus, who was fully human. Jesus was fully male and fully divine. So we can be redeemed as men. We can practice a Christ-centered type of masculinity, which serves, which is kind, which is loving, but is still 100% male.
Yes, and again, when you look at Christ, you see the whole range, don't you? I mean, at one point, consider the lilies of the field and compassion, and neither do I accuse you, and calling for people to be willing to be forgiven, and on the other hand, overturning tables and challenging the Pharisees. And there's just so much that you can begin to understand because Christ is our model. Let's get to the next section there. Where are the Christ-centered men? And the first issue that you bring us into, and again, as an individual, speaks on spiritual formation, body life. Can you speak to that?
Well, there are cultural issues at stake because when we think of a Christian man now, they're labeled. It's almost like, oh, you're a Christian man? We're maybe leery. But in the body of Christ, there's unsung heroes. Think about all the men that go to serve a single mom. Think about all the men that go to serve maybe a widow. They fix her fence. They fix her house. These are the behind the scenes. These are the way masculinity redeems itself. I'm working with a single mom, helping her fix her car. No one sees that. No one applauds that, but that's the behind the scenes. A young man who's learning how to be a dad for the first time, changing diapers or staying up late with a baby. This is real masculinity, redeemed masculinity, Christ-centered masculinity that's oftentimes not applauded by the world. You know, in the world, the guy says, I'm in charge here, or I get the corner office. But in Christ-centered masculinity, we put a towel over our arm and we find those people that are hurting, people that are broken. That's the people that Jesus was always attracted to. Jesus was always helping those who are hurting, those who are brokenhearted. And God is near those, and he uses us. You know, the scriptures say, I'll be a father to the fatherless. Who's going to do that? You and I are going to do that. We're going to be a father to the fatherless when we serve with Young Life or YMCA or be a boys' Little League baseball coach. That's the model that we need to practice in the world.
Again, that's the section on unity. Let's get to the one on diversity, because what it means to be a man does vary from culture to culture.
Absolutely.
And as an individual that I know also speaks on pastoral ministries and missions and things like that, you have a whole section to remind us that this isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all, is it?
That's right. And I was in Kenya, and they were gathering sticks and firewood, and I'm from Kansas. I grew up in Kansas. I thought, I'll go help. And they said, no. Only the women do that. And I thought, well, why? And that's a part of the home. That's part of, they're preparing the meal. They're cooking indoors. And they said, if you go over there, you'll be considered a woman. And I'm there showing the Jesus film with Campus Crusade for Christ. So I was shocked. But that's their cultural marker.
Right.
There's other identities where, other parts of the world, a male would be in a chef. And so here you have these two polar opposites. The male is the best chef in the whole town. And in Kenya, if you're over there cooking or gathering the sticks for the fire, you're considered. So we want to get at what does Scripture say about gender? Not what does culture say about gender, but what does Scripture say about gender? And there are some absolutes in Scripture, but not very many. And we have to be careful about labeling someone according to culture.
We'll come back and get into that in a little more detail, but as we're going to a break, let me just mention that we're coming to the end of our fiscal year, and as you go to the website to find out more about this book, A Courageous Identity, Accepting the Call of Christ-Centered Masculinity, scroll down and you'll see a banner that says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. There's a little red button there that says Give Now, and as we are getting close to our fiscal year end, matter of fact, next hour I'll spend some time talking about how many of you already have taken advantage of the match. We have up to a $94,000 match, and you have used some of it, but there is still much available to you. So that means, again, it's a dollar-for-dollar match. Your gift of $100 becomes $200. If you want to join us at the Truth Team level, $30 a month, $360 a year or more. At $360 becomes $720. So it's a great opportunity. Many times, many of you say, I'd love to support Point of View, but I'm even more excited when I can double my gift, and that's available right now. So again, you can go to pointofview.net or give us a call. The 800 number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We'll be right back.
America's founders called this nation an experiment. 250 years later, the question for us is, did the experiment work? Well, let's look at the history. Though not perfect, America has continued moving toward the promise of the Declaration that all men are created equal. Our nation has enjoyed amazing success and providential survival. So has the experiment succeeded? Well, yes. But will it succeed going forward? That depends on you. At Point of View, we know the American experiment owes its success to the biblical values upon which it was founded. Join Point of View this month as we work to restore a biblical worldview in American culture. Your gift will be doubled when you give by June 30th. Call or click today at pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're talking about the book, A Courageous Identity. In studio with me today, Dr. Paul Pettit, Accepting the Call of Christ-Centered Masculinity. It's a small group study for men. I might just mention at the end of every chapter, there's usually some definitions and always at least 5 discussion questions. So this is plug and play. If you wanted to get a copy or multiple copies, you could get started right away. If you'd like to have Paul come and speak to your group and kick it off, I think he'd be open to that. And we've been talking, Paul, of course, about unity and diversity, but one other chapter on individuality.
Yeah.
Of course, individuals are different, and each one of us, though we're created in the image of God, we are also different from one another. They're different gifts and callings. But also, you go from preaching to meddling at one point, and you start talking about how we handle our money. And that, I think, is also a great indicator sometimes of your commitment and your spirituality, isn't it?
That's right. A lot of times when you meet another man, you say, "Oh, I'm Paul." But the second thing you say is, "What do you do?"
Yeah.
And men measure themselves on the size of their house or the car they drive. But a stewardship is what we're talking about. How are you using your money to glorify God? Oftentimes the man is wanting to maybe steward the money in the home. So individuality is also, I need to be with other brothers in Christ. I don't need to live the Christian life alone. Isolated individualism can be dangerous if we're always isolated as individuals. We're a Christian man, but we need to be with brothers in Christ. Get good advice on stewardship and money and how do we handle our finances. We want to get in a group with other men and get good advice.
And that's why I think the study group idea is so good, because a minute ago we talked about Fatherless America, David Blankenhorn.
Yep.
Well, there are many books that have come out on the friendless American male.
Yep.
And as a matter of fact, one individual who did research at Yale University, Daniel Levinson, went out and tried to figure out why men oftentimes have a midlife crisis. And they asked lots of questions, but one of the interesting ones, Paul, was, do you have a close friend like you did when you were growing up? And most men said, no. Why should I? We sort of almost buy into the idea that, okay, we can be buddies when we're playing in the neighborhood. We can certainly be with a team. But then I go out into the world. And when I go out in the world, it's the Lone Ranger.
Right.
Of course, I always jokingly say, well, even Lone Ranger had Tonto, right?
That's right.
And there's a sense in which sometimes we don't have good, positive role models of the need for accountability and for us to actually work together. North American Christianity oftentimes is too individualistic.
Yes.
And so I appreciate the fact that you point that out as well. But before we get into the next section, there was a section, sometimes it's also easier to help people to see it visually, but you have a life map exercise. So there's a sense as you're going through the book, I might just say to our listeners, that you go through a chapter and then every once in a while there's an opportunity to stop and pause. And this is one of the places where you can stop and pause, the life map exercise, accepting the call and looking back. Can you explain that?
Well, all of us as men need to look back and take inventory. The unexamined life is not worth living. And who have been the men that have impacted me the most? Stop and think about that, for good or for ill. I've had students in one of my men's ministry courses write a paper on that, and you'd be shocked at the answers, some positive, some negative. I had a guy recently, obviously I never give any names or what year this was, but a guy said, I was 16 years old the first time my father introduced me to drugs. Unbelievable. Or we've had guys that said, I had a football coach, but he was physically abusive. Unbelievable. And then others who said, I had a youth pastor who changed my life, who showed me Jesus Christ, who taught me the Bible. Or I had a mentor who took me on a missions trip and opened up my eyes to the world. So we need to do that. We need to step back and think about, why did I decide to go to that university? What job did I decide to do? And think through, how has my life led up to this point, and how has God used the men in my life to mentor me and change me?
Well, again, that's part of that life map, and really we could preach on that for an entire hour. But I'm going to keep it moving because Section 3, how do Christ-centered men live? And this really breaks it down into looking at a number of key issues here: spiritual habits, mental habits, and physical habits. What about the spiritual habits? Because in some respects, men tend to be so busy, they sometimes are more likely to neglect the spiritual.
That's right.
They?
And women oftentimes do a better job at this. A lot of women's Bible studies, a lot of women's retreats. But men don't have to feel this legalism. That's what I'd like to emphasize.
Right.
They feel like, well, you had devotions 3 days in a row, but then you blew it. You missed a day. And so men maybe need smaller bites, maybe listening to Christian radio on the way to work, maybe reading some scriptures or listening to some scripture audio, or being in a men's small group. So they don't have to be legalistic and think it's a perfection, but is it a growth? is an effective Christianity.
Well, and I have some just great breakouts that I've mentioned already in terms of charts, but you also have like spiritual habits to incorporate in your routine. This goes on for the better part of a page. So you might say, oh, I hadn't thought about doing that, or I hadn't thought about doing that, I hadn't thought about doing that. So there's just a lot of very practical material, and that comes from your years of experience of really teaching about spiritual formation, right?
That's right. You think about exercising. I've been trying to exercise lately, like all of us have. And what would it be like if I just said, well, this is what I'm going to do. On August 15th, I'm going to lift weights for 12 hours. I'm just going to lift weights like crazy. Or would it be better to say, every Monday morning, I'm going to go for a long walk. Every Monday morning, I'm going to lift weights. Obviously, we would say the one-time event is not what we're looking for. It's the habits. It's the daily routines. It's the weekly routines. So for men, that challenge is, are you attending worship? Or are you reading the Bible? And not to be legalistic about it. That's the problem. A lot of people come down on, well, I tried that, but it didn't work. Brush yourself off, get back up, and just do something that clicks. Make it organic. But how is God molding me and shaping me and drawing me closer to himself?
Well, again, we've talked about the spiritual habits, and then you talk about mental habits, but that's when you list the 7 promises of a promise keeper, committed to honor Jesus Christ, who worship prayer and obedience and God's Word. Some people might think of that as being spiritual, and it is, but for those of us that either were at Promise Keeper events, we used to even do broadcasts from Promise Keeper events, those promises are, again, the kind of daily habits, and if you can begin to develop those habits, they become a routine. They really become part of your life, don't they?
That's right. And that's also where a couple of buddies come in. Hey, how are you doing in this area? Let's go through some of these and let's challenge each other on this. And that last question I remember from Promise Keepers was always, did you just lie to me? Wow. But the goal, too, now for Promise Keepers is moving from the stadiums to the circles.
Right.
And so this is the move that we're seeing today. A lot of small groups, a lot of guys, maybe a Friday morning breakfast like at Prestonwood, or a lunch group, or even just a hunting group, a fishing group, but using something like a curriculum or a study to get into that. So moving from the stadiums to the small circles is also an effective way for men to get with other men and improve in their walk with Christ.
And we've done this on this program a couple of times because we've talked about having a feast where you go hunting.
Yeah,
that's right. You are very familiar with some people that have been doing that over the years.
Yep.
We've had
Larry
others.
Moyer.
Larry Moyer has been
feast.
in there. Yeah, he loves to do that. Or, of course, we have some others that have gone to NASCAR races or they're going to sport. Sometimes getting men involved in another activity, that's another way to work through some of those ideas. And so that is the case. But I'll keep this moving because you also have physical habits. We've talked about spiritual habits, mental habits. Your heart, mind, and hands are deeply connected. We are spiritual, mental, and physical beings. And again, you give us a list of qualifications, which we find in 1 Timothy 3. And our good friend Gene Getz, he's been here many times before, says, if you look at the qualifications for an elder, of course, he then wrote a book called Measure of a Man.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a way to evaluate yourself, whether you're going to be in spiritual leadership or not. And it's amazing how many of those have to do with the physical or even the social, and we sometimes neglect that if we're really thinking that we're going to be overly spiritual.
In the Hebrew mindset, they think of the whole person, the shalom, the whole body. And so in North America, we bifurcate that. Oh, there's the soul, but my body, what does my body have to do with my walk with Christ, But God and Jesus look at us as a whole person. So everything we do, everything whether we eat or drink or whatever we do, let it come under the lordship of Christ. So it doesn't have to be just I read the Bible 24 hours a day, but my what do I eat? What do I watch? What do I consume in my media? So everything we do begins to mold us and shape us, and God is drawing us to himself. So he's encouraging us in these healthy patterns.
As you walk by the way, and as you drive, and you do carpool, and as everything else. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we've looked at 3 sections, but there is a 4th section about service, and so we will wind that down as well. If you just joined us, we've been talking with Dr. Paul Pettit. A book is entitled A Courageous Identity, Accepting the Call of Christ-Centered Masculinity. It is a book that I think you can be able to find in your local bookstore, published by Whitaker House, but if not, we have a link there. If you'd like to connect up with him, him. Let me encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. Next to his picture, we have a link to Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can click on some others. Of course, you can find him at Dallas Theological Seminary. It is a small group study for men. I highly recommend it, and I'm just thrilled he's in studio. We'll come back and talk more with him right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again and in studio with us for a few more minutes, Paul Pettit. Dr. Paul Pettit, again, is the author of A Courageous Identity, Accepting the Call of Christ-Centered Masculinity. But I thought we would get to the fourth section, which is, what do Christ-centered men do? Well, they serve in worship, serving in the home, serving in the community. And in some respects, servant leadership is something that we have certainly talked about so often here on Point of View. It's what you talk about at your seminary. But it does seem to me that this whole idea of servants and multiplication and maybe mentoring and discipleship are really key, aren't they?
Yeah. I think a lot of men are wondering, am I going to become a monk? Am I supposed to sit and meditate for 8 hours a day now? No, you take that knowledge, but it comes out in the hands. The heart and the head lead to actions. So we serve, we find a need in the community, or we ask the senior pastor or the elder, what could I do here at the church? So men oftentimes, as you know, Kerby, enjoy using their hands.
Right.
They would rather go do a building project. Give me something I can do.
Right.
Oftentimes, women do a great job of, I speak at men's retreats, and it's sometimes unorganized. The guys are like, well, I remember a bunch of guys brought 2-liter bottles of soda pop, 2-liter bottles. And another group of guys brought ice. That was it. The 2-liter bottles of soda pop and the ice. A women's retreat, they have doilies, they have a theme, they have decorations. Men's retreats, but so they're not into so much the fellowship, the organization. They want to do something. Give me something I can do. Give me a missions project. Let me serve a single mom. Let me serve a widow that needs her fence rebuilt. So oftentimes with the hands, we're going out and doing something and serving. We have the right motives. We're not doing it all for our selfishness or to make a lot of money. We're giving of ourselves. And you know what? Guys have told me later, man, I never felt better. When I was doing that, I realized I was serving. And they go to bed that night thinking, man, I had a great day today. I gave of myself. I wasn't selfish. It wasn't sinful. And I was out with other guys. We enjoyed it. We had a great time. So just because you're a Christian man, it doesn't mean you have to go to seminary or you have to become a bishop or a monk. It means you are living your Christian life out in a real world with real people, and God is going to use you in amazing ways.
Let's talk about mentoring, because we've often said that there are 3 men that you need in your life. An older man like Paul, a friend like Barnabas, and a younger man like Timothy. You need to be looking up, looking next to you and down. And it does seem to me that what we are finding is the real need to provide mentoring to this next generation, those of us that are a bit older. And there's a sense in which that is another aspect of service,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Sometimes when I speak at these men's retreats, there'll be an older group over here, and they're going, I wish there were some of these young guys I could pour into. And then I'll talk to some of the younger guys, and they'll literally say, yeah, I kind of need an older man in my life to, and I'm thinking, you guys need to get together. We make it organic. So we need to challenge pastors and church leaders, get some intergenerational ministry going. Don't just always have the young guys over here, always have the old guys over here, the Saturday morning breakfast where you make pancakes. Nothing wrong with that. But get some intergenerational ministry going where some older guys are pouring themselves into the younger guys, and the younger guys are learning. And, I had Chad Hennings tell me a quick story. He said he had an old dog, a very old dog, just laid around the house all day. But what he did, Kerby, was he got a puppy.
Yes.
And that puppy really began to wake up that old dog, and he was shocked that this old dog had so much life left in him. And I think of that story when I think of some of these younger guys need to teach older guys how to use tech, and how to log on and how to use Bluetooth. And some of the older guys really need to talk about, how did you stay married 40 years?
Good questions.
How are you being a grandparent? They can't even envision that. So we need older men Christian men pouring themselves into younger men, and we need younger men stepping up and leading small groups or learning from older men. That's very key. And the Bible says even that older women can disciple and mentor younger women. We don't talk about that very much in our culture, but that's what Paul said. Paul said, let the older women mentor the younger women, and that's countercultural today.
Well, again, you mentioned Chad Hennings. He endorses the book. Of course, Bill Hendricks, Mark Yarborough, Jeff Kinley, Bill Butterworth, matter of fact, Paul Weaver, virtually everybody that's endorsed the book has been on the program, and I'm so thrilled that you can be here. But let's talk about this idea of also ministering and serving in the family and the community, because it does seem to me that we think that service is only in the church, but a lot more of the service is going to happen out of 6 out of the 7 days. What you're going to do in your home and what you're going to do in your community.
That's right. So many young men are pulled in different ways. You got to go hard at work, but you got to be a great husband. Are you being a great husband? But are you being a great dad? But are you also spending some free time? So these young men feel pulled in so many different directions. But what we're saying is the type of person you're becoming is more important, because that lives itself out. As Prof. Hendricks used to tell me, much more is caught than taught.
Yes.
You live out the Christian life, your wife is going to see that. You live out the fact that you're chasing after Jesus Christ, your young son or daughter is going to notice that. So it's not so much that we have to say, well, 1/7 of my time I'll do this, 2/7 of my time I'll do this, 3, it's what type of man are you becoming so that you live this out in a marriage, in a parenting effort, in a work environment.
I might just mention your last chapter deals with a game plan exercise, a look forward, summoning the courage to live out your identity, because, again, these can be intentions, but they're not going to go any further unless you begin to get them on your to-do list, get them on your calendar, and the rest. And so in some respects, if somebody wants to move forward, or if this is something that you might want to encourage a man in your life, this is a book that you have written with that in my mind, and I'm just very impressed that you've been able to put together all sorts of things you've learned all these years teaching spiritual formation and pastoral ministries, put them in a book, which again is about 160 pages. Again, just a very useful resource, and one that I would encourage people, if they're involved in any kind of outreach to men, think seriously about getting a copy of the book.
Yeah, the game plan is exciting because no team goes into a game without some strategy. And so as men, we sometimes get in our 50s and 60s and someone says, hey, you better start thinking about retiring. And, I love golf. I like golf. And it gets a bad rap because the one thing people always say is, you're not just going to go play golf for the next 20 years, are you? And I say, I might, but I know in my heart, no, I want to be we have 4 grandkids now. I want to be a great grandfather.
Sure.
I want to do some missions trips. I want to encourage other men. So if I don't think about that, like you just said, and plan that out and maybe carve out space for that, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Prof. Hendricks used to tell me this guy just blew out his aorta on his way to Sarasota. He just was going to go lay on the beach the rest of his life. God is going to use us in our 70s, our 80s, our 90s to be a great influence on a next generation. So what's your game plan, though? What's your strategy? What's your game plan? And let's talk about that and maybe even write it out.
So again, if you want to contact Paul Pettit, we have a link to him on the website. And again, you can find some of the links that we've provided there if you'd like to find out more about the book, A Courageous Identity. As I mentioned at the outset, it just came out, so you may be able to find it in your local bookstore. Support your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get it in paperback. I also have it in Kindle, as you know, so I have it in both versions. And again, it is just a delight to have you in the studio. Let's do this again.
Great to be here, Kerby. Thank you.
And again, always fun when you bring some of the students to watch. We've got a few people watching today, but nothing like when you bring the whole crowd in. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about this book, I'd like to listen to it again, you can go to the website and certainly watch it or listen to it again or pass it on to others that may want to hear that. But most importantly, as you go to the website, don't forget, as you scroll down, you will see a section that says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. There's a place where, as we are coming to fiscal year end, we are in need of your financial support. We do have a match on the table. I can see from the numbers, and I'll talk about that a little bit more next hour. We have had many of you take advantage of that, but there is still match money available. So if you've been waiting to support Point of View and would like to have it doubled, please encourage you to go to the website pointofview.net, or during the break, perfect time to call. We'll talk to one of our staff, 800 1-800-347-5151. 1-800-347-5151. We'll go back with some news a little bit later with Robert Knight. All that coming up right after this.
To pass the torch of freedom to the next generation, the first thing we need to do is restore America's moral character. The founders knew that people need checks and balances, and that is why our federal government has 3 branches. But what about internal checks and balances? Human beings need an internal sense of accountability to something greater than themselves, to someone who motivates them to respect the law and love their neighbors. And that's why we believe that America needs to recover and restore biblical values. You can help by partnering with Point of View, where for over 50 years we have equipped listeners around the nation to apply a biblical worldview to every modern issue. And by the way, when you support us this month, your gift will be doubled. So please give now at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we'll spend some time, first of all, looking at some of the issues in the news. Bottom of the hour, we have our good friend Robert Knight, who, of course, writes for the Washington Times and a variety of other venues. One of the pieces we've posted, "The Clock is Ticking and Iran Knows It," but also thought I'd talk not only about foreign policy, but some domestic policy issues that he's written about as well. We'll do our best to try to wind down that as well. And I might, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we will, of course, be talking about this issue of socialism. I'll hold up our booklet on socialism. As a matter of fact, I might even hold up, since we have it here, the particular articles that we posted many months ago on this issue of socialism. We've gone from socialism is a big issue to socialism is become a huge issue. And I think the reason that you well know is because not only have you seen the election of socialist candidates in places like New York and even in Seattle, but then, of course, now it looks like we'll probably have a socialist mayor in the District of Columbia. And then we just, of course, as I mentioned the other day, and we will get into in more detail tomorrow, had the election in the primary of 2 individuals in very democratically secure districts of socialists as well. One of those is Daralisa Avila Sevelier, and she won the Democratic primary in the 13th Congressional District on Tuesday. And she is an individual that has talked about seizing the means of production. She talked about abolishing the police, abolishing prisons, if you can believe that, getting rid of any kind of natural borders, and also, and this is well documented, and I'll get into this in just a minute, supporting the destruction of the state of Israel. We may devote almost the entire first hour tomorrow to address some of those issues. This article by Brittany Bernstein is one I've posted for you today, but we're going to go more into who she is. By the way, she's not the only one. Claire Valdez also won the primary, and she's another with the Democratic Socialist of America. And these are individuals that probably will be elected because of who their constituency is and how the particular Democratic district so gerrymandered that it's pretty likely. And it was intriguing to see that she won when she ran against the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Now, it is difficult to unseat an incumbent. It's even more difficult to unseat somebody who is heading up a congressional caucus because he or she probably has all sorts of funding and all sorts of things. So to completely, as a first-time candidate, unseat a very liberal Democrat, but he was apparently, for some of the people in the 13th Congressional District, not liberal enough, and so that is the case. But don't take my word for it. This article you can read by Brittany Bernstein quotes then from CNN. And CNN has done the work for us because they have actually then posted information about, isn't this surprising, the now deleted account on X, which includes, and this is their words, CNN's words, thousands of posts and reposts expressing support for abolishing police, abolishing prisons, and abolishing borders, as well as seizing private property, nationalizing major industries, and calling into question even the right of Israel to exist. If you want to have somebody who could be considered a card-carrying socialist or communist, I'll hold up our booklet here, she qualifies. So anybody that says we're just referring to her in that way, that's how she refers to herself as well. In her biography, you can go to her platform there, you can see, interestingly enough, that she has hashtags like hashtag Free Palestine, also tagged Occupied the Land, hashtag Black Lives Matter, on and on. She also says she has a real penchant for communism. As a matter of fact, she actually is convinced that this is the case. Matter of fact, in 2019, she even uses the phrase, this is Karl Marx, seize the means of production. These are individuals who, from any reasonable stance, could be considered socialists because that's how they describe themselves. This booklet I did a while back on the Democratic Socialists of America, something we'll get into with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because he says the Democratic Party is becoming the Bernie Party, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But again, she even talks about not only seizing the means of production, but also she, when was challenged about, well, what do you really mean by defund the police? She says it means ending policing, full stop, period. No more police at all, ever. This is probably about a radical candidate we have seen in some time. And when informed about some of this, the current mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani, actually said he wasn't aware of her past comments when he endorsed her, but he didn't pull his endorsement nevertheless. So, again, who is this individual? We're going to go into it in more detail tomorrow, because there's some very good articles, not only by Dr. Merrill Matthews, but by John Fund and by Charles Cook and a variety of other individuals. She is a 32-year-old investigator at the Public Defender's Office in New York City, also is a doctoral student in sociology at the City University of New York, studying the ways, this is her words, the ways black immigrants from Latin America are impacted by the U.S. criminal system and deportation. Shows you kind of where she is there. And, of course, you have had situations where she in the past has been out there in these demonstrations. One was the demonstration all out for Palestine and actually cheering on Hamas. As a matter of fact, she was one of the individuals cheering, saying 700. At that time, that was the known death toll of Israelis. Now we know it's 1,200. But at the time, she was cheering 700, 700, 700, which was the death toll of those who were killed by Hamas, and making all sorts of other obscene gestures. We won't go into the detail, but you can read this article on your own, and shouting, globalize the intifada, and even talking about trying to combat all sorts of influence there as well, including, of course, the whole idea of disinvestment. So we're talking about someone pretty radical indeed. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to move away from that, but in some respects go to something that is very close to that, and that is John Stossel. He, of course, puts out videos, and I watched the video the other day, and now he has a column that goes with it in which we are seeing that many of these socialists, we'll now talk about what's going on in Seattle, are individuals that are changing whether or not people can be involved in what's called gig work. And some of these jobs involve, things like dog walking, Rover, my daughter, by the way, does Rover, TaxRabbit, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, whatever. And in an effort to, quote, help those individuals involved in gig work, they basically have made it much more difficult for them to even use those particular technologies and those particular gig work opportunities. So once socialists are convinced that they're going to do good, here's a good illustration out of Seattle to show that they do great harm. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
There's a phrase I often hear at conferences and on YouTube videos that is usually credited to Lynn Alden, author of the excellent book Broken Money. She and others often use the phrase "nothing stops this train" to illustrate the unstoppable momentum of fiscal deficits. She borrowed the phrase from a line in the program Breaking Bad. Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager and founder of Bridgewater Associates. I think he might start using the phrase. He was in Washington, D.C. to meet with senior leaders on the Republican side and Democratic side about the budget deficit. He explained that virtually everyone agrees that you have to get the budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. He then asked them the logical question, why can't you make a pledge that you will get it down to 3%? They explained the absolute policies that must exist. You must make statements like, I will absolutely pledge not to raise your taxes. I will absolutely pledge not to reduce your benefits. He concluded that this is the equivalent of an absolute pledge not to change the trajectory we're on in order to have a better set of circumstances than the likely financial crash that we're going to have. He lamented that they all agree about the consequences of this debt problem, and they all agree that they cannot speak up about it because their constituents would throw them out of office, and their political parties would exert enough pressure on them that it is impossible to make those compromising statements and actions that bring together the revenue and expenses to produce a good budget. You know, we have a $39 trillion national debt and nearly $2 trillion deficits each year. Ray Dalio's conversation with the political leadership illustrates that Congress can't stop the debt train. And that's why I've concluded nothing stops this train. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
By now, you've probably figured out that the theme of socialism is going to be around for a while. If for no other reason than we've seen the election of certain candidates, but also just the kind of policies that have been implemented. Let's go to the city of Seattle. The mayor there, Katie Wilson, but this was actually implemented by the Seattle City Council, which is made up of some pretty radical individuals as well. And John Stossel, in his piece, which we've posted for you to read if you would like, or you can watch the video, says not long ago new kinds of jobs appeared, and these are what are called app-based gig work. And I mentioned a few, Rover and DoorDash and Uber and Lyft and all the rest. But over time, some of the so-called workers' rights advocates, and especially many of the socialists, have said, wait a minute, if people are involved in what's called gig work, they don't necessarily vote with the unions. They don't even join the unions. And sometimes they're working really long and hard and they don't even get minimum wage. So it's time to fix that. So the Democratic Socialists have a solution. Seattle City Council imposed a $26 delivery driver minimum wage. So what could go wrong? I mean, again, the argument would be, well, gig workers don't make enough money, so we'll just make sure that they get paid more. But you know, if you know anything about economics, what's going to happen next? Because what you then had to do is that DoorDash and Uber Eats had to add at least a $5 fee to consumers to help cover the cost of these regulations. And then you started getting complaints from the various residents of Seattle saying, I ordered a $12 sandwich. First of all, it's amazing you have to pay $12 for a sandwich, but we'll set that aside. And that grew to $32. Imagine thinking that it wasn't so long ago that I could pay $5 or $6 for a sandwich. Okay, I'll put up with $12, but I'm not expecting to spend $32 for a sandwich. And this resident said, well, you know what? I just deleted the app. And guess what? Nobody should be surprised. If you know anything about economics, work became so slow that DoorDash received 1.7 million fewer orders from Seattle. This, of course, is what happens when politicians dictate wages. Well, one of the people that John Stossel interviewed was Judge Glock. That is his name, although we will be talking about now California trying to ban the sale of Glock guns, but that's a different story. We'll get to that another day. And he said, first of all, obviously, when you're increasing costs to businesses, you're going to, by definition, increase the cost to consumers. And so instead of saying, okay, maybe this was a mistake to impose a $26 delivery driver minimum wage, instead of saying we made a mistake, the former Seattle City Council president, that would be Sarah Nelson, said, well, we created a problem and it's our responsibility to fix it. But instead of repealing the harmful law, they said, no, we just need to readjust the numbers. If we had gotten the minimum pay standard right, we would not see a decline in the revenue. These people live on a world that is convinced that money grows on trees. Price controls never work, John Stossel points out. Flexible pricing does. And again, Judge Glock says, you know, we get these smug politicians think that if they can just get the price right, then everything's going to work out. And they're not going to have any improved well-being for the people. Instead, what they find is a lot of people that depended on the so-called gig work had to go somewhere else. And lest you think that Seattle is a one-off, I will now pick on maybe Zohran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City. And in this particular case, they have a similar minimum wage, which is, again, for app-based drivers. And again, Judge Glock said the decrease in tips and the increased competition for jobs offset all the gains that the imposed minimum wage would have provided. It's this continual whack-a-mole tendency, he said. The market responds, so politicians try to pass a new regulation to try to prevent that response. They think the next regulation will somehow squelch the greed out of the system, but it's just not going to happen. So again, this is a piece that just reminds you that the economic system works when you allow the economic system to work. And the economic system fails when you try to impose your desire to force prices and wages in a way that simply doesn't make economic sense. Which brings me to my last piece, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more tomorrow, by Byron York. Republicans hang on. He points out that by most estimates, we know historically that the president's party almost always loses House seats during midterm elections. Since the 1930s, you've only had like 2 exceptions to it. And when you look at the direction of the country, You have 59%, almost 60%, almost 6 out of 10 people saying the country is going in the wrong direction. And so they may, for one way or the reason, blame members of Congress or the president. The economy at the moment isn't doing as well as it could be, although I certainly see the stock market going up, prices of oil going down. But of course, you have that whole history as well. And so again, one of the writers, Byron York, for, of course, his newspaper, points out that if you put everything together, it would seem that you would have at least a massive Democratic victory. But why not a blowout? And he says, well, there's plenty of reasons for it. We've just been talking about that. He says, there's some serious problems that Republicans might have. But the biggest problem, he points out, is the voting public's low regard for Democrats. In the Real Clear Politics average, the favorability of the Democratic Party, you ready for this? 36%. The unfavorable is 56%. Now, again, I'm not saying that Republicans are doing much better, but if you both do not like the Republicans or the Democrats, it's maybe a little less likely that they're going to want to vote for either party. And so we'll see where that comes. But I think it is very interesting to see that as well. There's another factor, of course, and that is gerrymandering, which we've been talking about for some time. And again, one strategist put it this way: the whole map has been gradually gerrymandered to the point where 80% of the congressional races are won entirely in the primaries. I just alluded to that a minute ago. That's true on the Republican side. It's true on the Democratic side. There was a time when people would say things like, I vote for the man, not the party. The middle was as high as 25% of the vote. Now the middle, or the so-called swing voters, maybe about 12%. So the harsh reality is, if you're a Democrat running in a Democratic majority congressional seat in district, probably going to get reelected. Now, a couple of these individuals have been able to unseat incumbents, but they're still Democrats, so they're still in Democratic seats. When you look at the Republican side, the same thing. These have been gerrymandered as well. And as a result, as I've said before, it was more likely to remove a member of the Soviet Politburo than to remove some of the individuals from some of these districts. So we'll see where it goes. Historically, it has been very much the case since the 1930s that the president's power, that would be the Republican president's power, a party, actually loses in midterm elections. There actually were a first two times in which you had, of course, in 1998 during Bill Clinton's impeachment, again in 2002 in the aftermath after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But most of the time, you see that in this case, because you have a Republican in the White House, Republicans would lose seats in the House. We'll see how that goes. But as Byron York points out, Republicans hang on. And one of the reasons is the topics we just addressed a minute ago, whether it's socialist candidates winning in the District of Columbia, in the New York primary, or even in, of course, places like Seattle and New York City and all sorts of other places, or even the policies that have been implemented. It certainly has changed the equation in a remarkable way. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Robert Knight. Going to talk about, of course, some very important issues, one of which, of course, is a foreign policy issue, but we'll also talk about some of these domestic policy issues. And as we go to the break, let me again encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. You might click on that button that says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. There's a button there to give now. And of course, if you want to go to the website or even give us a call, that number is 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. Not my words. That's Ronald Reagan. And he was right. We can't take our freedom for granted. For 250 years, those words in our Declaration of Independence, acknowledging the human rights granted to all of us by our Creator, have guided and inspired generations of Americans to protect the torch of freedom and pass it on to us. But will we pass that torch to the next generation? You can join a team dedicated to doing just that. In fact, Point of View has been passing on freedom and the biblical values that support it for over 50 years. Join us this month, and any donation you give will be doubled. Give at pointofview.net or call us toll-free at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in this last half hour, we are privileged to have with us once again Robert Knight, a good friend of this ministry, author and regular weekly columnist for the Washington Times. Of course, we have a link to his website, and of course, an individual that has served as a news editor for the Los Angeles Times and a variety of different venues as well. We have posted his piece more recently, The Clock is Ticking and Iran Knows It. Also thought we would get into a couple others that he's talked about in terms of how various mobs have begun to take over churches and the rest. Author of many books, Liberty on the Brink, The Coming Communist Wave. And Robert, I would be remiss if we didn't, for a few minutes, get you talking about communism and socialism, because it does seem to me, whether you're in Washington, D.C. or the state of New York, it seems like, or even Seattle, Washington, everywhere we go, we're picking up someone else that is a socialist taking over our government. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're probably referencing the recent election in New York, Kerby, which shocked the Democratic Party because the farthest out leftists won all the races, at least the ones in New York City, 3 congressional races, and they're in Democratic districts, so they will win in November. And the 3 people who won are all the way to the left. They want government takeover of health care. They want free child care. They're anti-capitalist. One of the most shocking things is that they are anti-Israel. Mm-hmm. They're openly anti-Semitic. One of them talked about wiping her hands on the American flag, and that this country, she hates this country. And these are people who previously in America wouldn't have a whisper of a chance of being elected to anything, much less Congress. And yet there we have it in New York City. New York Mayor Mamdani, Zoran Mandami, endorsed them all, and he's happy as can be. And he's a far leftist. He's an Islamist. He's anti-Israel. He has people around him who are openly anti-Semitic and call for eliminating Israel. And the hardest thing to believe, Kerby, is this is happening in New York City. It has the largest Jewish population in the world.
Just amazing.
And isn't it amazing? Well, I'll tell you what explains it. The Democrats have perfected the turnout, especially among Muslims. There are now hundreds of thousands of Muslims now in New York City, and I understand that 93% of them voted. Wow. As opposed to maybe, 40% of the Jews in New York. So if you have a sizable minority that wants to throw its weight around, you could end up with basically Islamist/communist congressmen.
And again, just to pick out one, we're going to spend some time tomorrow talking about that. And I did before you came on in the 13th Congressional District, Darelisa Avila Chevalier. But here's an individual that not only has talked about wanting to destroy Israel and was one of the ones shouting 700 because that was at the time how many they thought had been killed in Israel by Hamas, but wants to actually seize the means of production, abolish the police. She made it very clear, we're not just defund the police. We just don't want to have police at all. Don't want to have prisons. Don't want to have borders. These are very radical. And as an individual who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, yes, we had candidates like that ran every once in a while for the Communist Party. They didn't win. These candidates, whether it's her or Claire Valdez or Zoran Mamdani, or just a few minutes ago, we were talking about what is going on in Seattle. You have the mayor there, Katie Wilson. These are beyond the pale. These are true democratic socialists, are they not?
Yeah, and the term democratic socialist doesn't really explain how far out they are.
Yes.
They are communists. They want the government to own the means of production. Once you do that, there's no freedom left because the government can do what they do in communist China, which is have a social credit system where if you step out of line and challenge the party in any way, they use centralized bank digital currency to cancel any transactions you have. So say you criticize a government official, suddenly you can't get on a train, get on an airplane, buy food for your family. I mean, this is the totalitarian nightmare that these people have been advocating for the United States. I mean, it's hard to believe, but here we are.
Well, we are. My guest in the first hour is just talking about how they have some Chinese students that are waiting to get their actual visa, but the visa's waiting because they're checking the social credit score of these Chinese students. And if by chance they'd said anything critical of the government, that was enough to revoke some of those. So that is already a reality in certain parts of the world, and it shows where we're headed. So I'll hold up our booklets here on capitalism, socialism, and even on the road to serfdom, because these are the kinds of things we'll be talking about even tomorrow. Of course, our February issue is on are Christianity and socialism compatible, and I got a feeling we got a preview to a future Robert Knight column, so we will certainly post that when it comes out. But I did want to do a little bit of time talking about this piece that you did write. The clock is ticking and Iran knows it, because people have saying, why can't we resolve what's going on in Iran? And Iran leaders know, and I've actually seen one place where they actually gave an English translation of some of the things that one of the leaders was saying. We know that we can push them because things like elections and midterms and all the rest prevent them from actually being able successful. We're not big enough to stand up to them, but we know that their weakness is, and you've been writing about the fact that the clock is ticking, and Iran is well aware of it, aren't they?
Yeah, Iran is a totalitarian regime like communist China, and they don't have to face elections, and they know that our representatives do, including President Trump's party. The Republicans are on the ballot on every House seat in the country in November. And people are upset about gas prices. They went back up over $4 a gallon. Of course, people forget that under Joe Biden, they went as high as $5 a gallon. But and the inflation we're dealing with, well, this is on top of the 20% inflation over the 4 years of the Biden administration. So people have very short memories, and the Iranians, like any good totalitarians, are counting on the attention span of the American public to say, oh, stop the pain, do whatever you have to do, sign anything, just make sure oil gets cheaper again and I can fill up my car. I think President Trump has to do a couple things. One, I'd prefer he did more to arrange regime change, because I think if he leaves in place the Ayatollahs, we're going to just go down and have to do it again in a couple of years. The other thing is he has to explain to the American people why he bombed in the first place, sparing us from a nuclear Iran. I mean, this is a group that's so radical They're trying to bring about an apocalypse. They're 12ers, which is a reference to the 12th Imam, who is supposed to be alive today and will be brought back to end the world if they can generate enough chaos. This is not like dealing with even the Chinese or the Russians. We're dealing with people who, if they got the nuclear bomb, would use it, first on Israel, then us. So President Trump did the right thing. He went after their nuclear capacity, and they started picking on shipping in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, and people of Iran have been slaughtered in the streets. It's really time for this regime to go. But President Trump only has 5 months to the next election, and he's got to get those gas prices down. So let me float this idea, Kerby. Could it be that what he has up his sleeve is, okay, we're going to have this memorandum of understanding, which nobody likes, and then wait for the midterm elections. And then after that, maybe I can do with Iran the right way I really want to.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that. Yeah. See if we can postpone it. And at least, as you point out in your column here, you're hoping that you're not talking about a Senator James Tallarico or a Senator Graham Plattner. So we will get into that after the break. And also, I just thought I might mention something we wanted to talk about when we didn't get you on last time. What's a little mob attack on a church service? And that reminds us of the fact that sometimes people think, well, I'm safe because I'm not speaking about these political issues. Well, it doesn't make any difference. Some of them thinking that there were some ICE agents that had actually been in that church was enough to have this poor church in St. Paul, Minnesota attacked. And that's another piece by Robert Knight. If you'd like to know more about Robert Knight, of course, as we always do, we have all sorts of links to his website, to his other social media. And, of course, we have a couple of the columns that we've posted so that you can read those. I would certainly encourage you to do so, and we'll come back and continue our conversation with our good friend Robert Knight right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Robert Knight. Again, if you'd like to know more about him or a variety of different organizations that he's involved with, we certainly have all those links on the website at pointofview.net. But Robert, I thought for just a minute, we'd go back to something you wrote at the, still in this last month. You wrote it in June, but you were talking about something that happened in January at City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the reason you did so is, first of all, we need to talk about what happened. You called it, what's a little mob attack on the church service? And so, first of all, we have talked about this. Matter of fact, we oftentimes talk about your columns even when you're not on. But the reason for the column in June, because that was back in January, is then the decision by the city attorney to dismiss the case. So if you want to actually encourage more people actually disrupting church services, keep deciding not to press charges. And it does seem to me that your piece that you wrote just earlier this month is a warning to every church in America. But give us the background and why you thought this was something you needed to write about.
Well, in January, a mob broke into City's Church in St. Paul and disrupted the service, scared children, left them in tears, mobbed the people as it wrecked the service, and then they harangued them as they exited. Just something out of 1930s Nazi Germany. And they were charged with all kinds of charges. And then in early June, the St. Paul city attorney, Irene Cow, dismissed all the state charges, saying, quote, "The right to peacefully protest is protected, as is the right to exercise one's religious beliefs. Balancing these equally important rights is paramount to our decision today." And I ask you, what do you mean balancing? This mob comes in and wrecks their freedom of religion. Nobody has the right to come into a private property, and that's what churches are, and disrupt a service. And she's saying, yeah, they do because it's free speech. And she's a Democrat, of course, so she's all for exercising free speech at the expense of churches, and doesn't see anything wrong with it. And I like what Bill Donahue said, the head of the Catholic League, and he said, if people of faith cannot practice a religion without intimidation and interference, it means their First Amendment right to religious liberty means nothing. And he said about her, he said, you know, if your workplace was invaded by a mob, I don't think that it would stop you from screaming to high heaven if protesters invaded your space. But you don't seem to have any problem when it's a church being invaded. This is serious stuff, because if you don't push back, it just gets worse.
Let's, if I can, broaden it a little bit, because we've had Kelly Shackelford on most Fridays, or someone else from First Liberty, because as you point out, we're not just talking about churches. How about synagogues? Think of all the anti-Semitic incidents, not only in this country, but especially overseas. Then let's also talk about mosques, because they're not immune either. And so in some respects, once you start a precedent that says, I can step into your service, and it could be a synagogue, it could be a mosque, or it could be a church, it could be Protestant or Catholic. Once that's allowed, once I then reward bad behavior, I think you're going to get more bad behavior, don't you think?
Yeah, that's what we saw in college campuses during the anti-Semitic protests. Nothing happened to the protesters, and they were making Jewish students terrified, telling them they're not welcome on campus anymore. And until the Trump administration stepped in and went after the college administrators, nothing happened. The protests got worse, and you have to push back on this stuff. You can't just sit back and hope it goes away. And we've seen what's happened in Great Britain, where a lot of immigrant Muslims have been doing terrible things to girls and women. And the authorities have been afraid to do anything because they don't want to be called racist or Islamophobic. So thousands of girls have been victims. And I won't get into how bad it was, but the news media have ignored this. All major networks in the U.S. have ignored this major report that was just issued by a member of Parliament. That's just eye-opening. And we're seeing a pattern now, and this will be my next column, Kirby, about these huge, major stories that the media are ignoring, as if they're not happening. It looks like Soviet news coverage, where they only print things that push their agenda and nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, on her way out the door, the head of national intelligence gives all this information about Anthony Fauci, and not only does the Washington Post not cover it, they do a hit piece on Tulsi Gabbard 2 days later, and nobody covers it. So I'm looking forward, as I always am, to every Robert Knight column, and it is amazing how many times these stories come out, and the mainstream press or the legacy press doesn't cover it at all.
This was a huge story. She's got chapter and verse of how Anthony Fauci arranged for taxpayer funding of the EcoHealth Alliance, which then funded bat virus research in Wuhan, in the laboratory which is pretty much been identified as where the COVID virus was hatched and escaped, and lied about it before Congress. I mean, this is huge. Of course, you know, on his way out, Joe Biden issued an auto pen pardon of Dr. Fauci. But still, this is a major story because COVID affected the whole world. And we had lockdowns, we had people dying, we had vaccines forced on people. I mean, this is huge. And they're saying, nothing to see here.
Well, again, we did cover it just the other day, and we cover these stories. And just before we wind down today, we're in the midst of our fiscal year end. And I thought for just a minute, you've appreciated the fact that we do cover the kind of stories that you try to write about, but the mainstream press ignores. What would you encourage our donors to do if they would want to support this ministry?
Look, folks, the media have gotten worse and worse. And I used to be in it. I was at the LA Times and several other papers, and I've never seen it this bad, where they are so dedicated to a left-wing agenda and they hate President Trump so much that they skew everything. You need to get other sources for your information, and Point of View is one of the best out there. Kerby does a heck of a job. I've listened to him over the years, and I've been on the program, and he's right up to speed on everything, and you can get stuff you're just not going to get anywhere else. So if you like this option, and you should take advantage of it, you really ought to donate to Point of View.
Well, again, Robert, I appreciate your encouragement, and always great to have you on here. Let me just mention that we do have a banner there. It says Restoring America's Godly Heritage. There's a a red button. We got some green ones too, but the Give No button is a red button that you can click on. And again, that is at the website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can give us a call at 800-347-5151. Well, I know what I'm going to be posting as soon as it comes out, and that is your next column. So, Robert Knight, it is always a delight to have you on the program. Thank you for writing about issues that many of the people in the mainstream press are ignoring, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Okay, Kerby, it's always good being on Point of View with you.
Well, let me just real quickly mention, again, we have that button says Give Now. It's a red button, and you can also go to the website, pointofview.net. You can also give us a call. Even though we're going off the air, we'll answer the phone, 800-347-5151. Of course, we have a match on the table, a dollar-for-dollar match, so we'd love to hear from you. As always, I thank both of the Megans for engineering the program and producing the program. Looking forward to our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
To pass the torch of freedom to the next generation, the first thing we need to do is restore America's moral character. The founders knew that people need checks and balances, and that is why our federal government has 3 branches. But what about internal checks and balances? Human beings need an internal sense of accountability to something greater than themselves, to someone who motivates them to respect the law and love their neighbors. And that's why we believe that America needs to recover and restore biblical values. You can help by partnering with Point of View, where for over 50 years, we have equipped listeners around the nation to apply a biblical worldview to every modern issue. And by the way, when you support us this month, your gift will be doubled. So please give now at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.